vendors. So there's not much more to be said in that other than watch this space. I think it's something that's needed clarification for a while myself, and hopefully we will get that soon. Just vouchers, I suppose, just kind of revenue are very focused on vouchers applying at the moment. There's kind of, for a few years now, there's been a bit of a mantra coming from revenue as I see it, in that if you don't have vouchers to back up expenditure, we come and review it. You don't have the vouchers, we're not allowing that expenditure, and that's kind of the start and end of it. So we're kind of constantly saying to clients, if you don't have the vouchers, revenue are likely to disallow the expenditure. And in practice, we find that that's what revenue is doing. Okay, so that's kind of data mining conscious and kind of starting to run out of time here. So on the, I suppose really the dwelling house relief has obviously been impacted by the Dean case. Everybody is I'm sure pretty familiar with the dwelling house relief rules. And one of the big changes, I suppose, between the Pre-Finance Act 2016 changes, which is what the Dean case ruled on, and the current legislation which was drafted before the Dean case was heard, but is obviously in effect now, is that previously you weren't allowed to have an interest in any other residential property, whereas post Finance Act 2016, you're not allowed to be beneficially entitled to other residential property, to an interest in any other residential property on the date of the inheritance. That, to my mind, implies that you have to have a beneficial interest in the property that's actually the subject of the relief on the date of inheritance. The wording of the legislation is you cannot be beneficially entitled to an interest in any other dwelling house. And there's an implication there, I feel, that you have to have an interest in the dwelling house which is the subject of the relief. You have to have a beneficial interest in that dwelling house. The Dean case, which was on the old legislation, which had different tax rules, basically found that the beneficiary isn't beneficially entitled to anything, which is in the course of administration of the estate until the net residue of the estate has been ascertained, which will tie in with your CAT valuation date. So, post-Dean, the legal position is that you're not beneficially entitled to anything until the CAT valuation date, which is at odds with the current legislation, in that the current legislation, to qualify for the relief, you have to have a beneficial interest on the date of death. So there's, I feel, an argument that anything that's passing through an estate to beneficiaries is technically not going to qualify for dwelling house relief. In practice, haven't seen a case yet where revenue have looked to disallow it, and where an individual has taken a benefit from an estate. And it certainly would be contrary to the spirit of legislation, and I don't really see revenue going there. But there is that technical issue, and if you were to take that view, then the only situation where you could, or some of the only situations where you could qualify for dwelling house relief would be on property passing by survivorship on a death, where you do have beneficial entitlement on the date of death, or possibly property that's passing after the end of intervening life interest as well, which again passes by operation of law on the date of death, so the beneficial entitlement does come into existence on the date of the inheritance. So, I suppose the issue, or kind of a key issue that I would potentially see with that, is where you have a disagreement on something else. So revenue to take the approach that we're not going to stop disallowing dwelling house relief on assets that are passing through the residue of the estate, because to do that, I suppose, is kind of just going against what the relief is effectively for. But there was a particular case that revenue decided they didn't like something else about the relief. So we had a case recently we heard of a case where revenue were saying that a beneficiary who had an interest in a company that held a residential property had an interest in another property, so couldn't qualify for dwelling house relief, which is not what the CAT legislation does. It's wrong. The legislation provides that you look through a company in terms of where a gift is coming from, where a gift is going to, if it's going through the company, but the legislation does not at any point say that if you have an interest in a company, that you have an interest in the assets in the company. That's not the legal position. That's not what happens from a tax perspective. So an individual in revenue taking that view that they had an interest in in another dwelling house, who the taxpayer disagrees with and says, don't agree, going to take you to the TSC on that and appealing this. If you go to the TSC and it's come through the residue in a state and you don't have that beneficial interest, can the TSC actually allow the relief? Because the relief technically is potentially not available because you don't have beneficial entitlement to anything. Revenue kind of generally saying concessionally, yes, okay, you can have the relief, that's what the legislation is supposed to do, but it's not what the legislation does. So if it's not what the legislation does, and you go to the TSC on something like that, are the TSC going to be forced, or is their hand going to be forced and say, yeah, kind of, I agree, kind of, you're technically correct on the ownership through the company point, but I suppose there's an issue here in that the legislation requires that you beneficially, the property that's subject to relief is the only property that you have a beneficial interest in on the date of the inheritance. Posting, you didn't have a beneficial interest on the date of the inheritance, so we can't actually allow the relief. What you're arguing with revenue is not the reason that we can't allow the relief, but we can't allow the relief because we have to operate the law. We can't operate revenue concessions. So I don't know if that's kind of something that the TSC could potentially do. It's an issue that I wouldn't like to be taking a risk on as a taxpayer. And I think there's something similar to agricultural relief, and I think the main points to make on agricultural relief and dwelling house relief at the moment, as I see it, is that the legislation that's there, what revenue are doing in the revenue manual is slightly different to what the legislation is doing. The biggest, I suppose, difference that I see in agricultural relief terms is that if you look at the legislation on agricultural relief, there's a requirement that the beneficiary meets the 80% financial farmer test throughout the 6 years post evaluation date, if you read legislation literally, which you should obviously always do. But revenue then saying the revenue manual, no, don't worry about that. Kind of, you don't need to do that. You never had to do that before. Why would you do it now? You do it now because legislation says you do. But that's not a revenue in practice. So again, if you're to go to the TSC on something like that, and it's so transpired that you met the 80% financial farm test in the day of inheritance, or you're scuppering an appeal on something else, because the tax legislation doesn't allow it in another area where revenue operate concessions. I think the other thing in agricultural relief is on the revenue manual. When the active farmer test and the activity test came in after Finance Act 2014, I suppose the time that at the time they were brought in, the reason to bring them in, it wasn't revenue that were promoting this. It was I think it was more a Department of Agriculture incentive to actually just promote the use of farmland. And at the time, I didn't see any particular barriers being raised to people qualifying for relief, because to me it just made sense that if you have farmland you're taking it, it only makes sense that it's used by somebody. If I'm not going to use it myself, I'm going to lease it, I'm going to at least get income from it. So I didn't really see it as an issue, but I think the way that they updated the legislation at the time, and then kind of taxed by legislation and untaxed then by concession in the revenue manual in a lot of cases, to kind of deal with some practical issues that the new legislation threw up. And I think if you're to read the revenue manual, I think you have to read the revenue manual if you're looking at agricultural relief and making a claim for the client. But if you're to read the revenue manual, you certainly get the impression that revenue are a little bit relaxed, I think, about the operation of agricultural relief, and kind of a few concessions to be made in a few different areas, which is all what the legislation is doing. So you can certainly read it and take the view that they're quite relaxed on the active farmer test and the activity test, that if you show intention to do it. One example that I always think of is the lease to an active farmer. Revenue say in their manual that if you're actively farming the land yourself, but you can't do straight away an evaluation date for practical reasons, that you, once you do so within, I think it's a period of 12 months, they're happy enough to accept that as you actively farming the land yourself. Whereas the lease from the valuation date doesn't have a similar carve out in the revenue manual. So the strict technical position part of the legislation is that you have to have the lease in place on the CAT valuation date, which practically speaking can be quite difficult in terms of the personal representative getting a lease in place. And you also have to know to do it, to get a lease in place before the land is before the grant issues, so that there is a lease in place on the CAT valuation date to technically meet the terms of the relief. And we're I suppose, relatively relaxed about agriculturally from revenue's approach to it until we saw minutes from a TALC meeting, which was a petitioner query whether revenue would allow agriculturally for both part farmed and part leased. So revenue, I suppose, a whole lot of various concessions in the revenue manual, where you've got land that's leased for a period of time, then farmed, or farmed and then leased, and they'll allow you, the legislation doesn't allow you, they'll allow you to change uses over. But the particular query was where you've got part farmed and part leased, so same sort of thing, and just slightly different. Would revenue allow the relief? Would revenue allow the relief? And revenue indicated that that's not what the legislation says, so the relief doesn't apply. So that, I suppose, was a bit of an eye opener in terms of you've got to be very careful here. If you're not in the legislation, you don't have a revenue annual concession, you really want to be making a submission to revenue on it. And again, you kind of putting appeals in jeopardy then as well if you've got kind of a small technical issue like the 80% financial farmer test, which you don't meet throughout that 6-year period revenue. Say you don't in the revenue manual, but if you go to the TSC, can revenue take account of what revenue do in practice? I think arguably not. So leases to active farmers is something that I'm a little bit nervous about, and I'd always look to try and get one in place if we could before the CAT evaluation. If there wasn't, if there was kind of agriculture, I think I'd be going to make a submission to revenue on it because it is off the legislation. I think that's kind of pretty much it, and just a few other points, but nothing too hectic, and I think it's time to wrap it up. So thanks for your attention.
Thanks really, Brian, and I think there's an awful lot for us to take away and I suppose to think about, and I certainly find that in practice that point on the agricultural relief and the lease it's an interesting one, because I suppose if you have an executor who has an authority pre-grant, you have someone who's in a position to sign a lease, but if it's in a testative state you don't, and where are revenue going to fall on issues like that. I'm conscious that we're at time now, so I suppose I'd ask those of you maybe who are under pressure if you'd like to leave now, and if we can take one or two questions if there are any, for those of you who have time, for Brian, if there are any in the room. In that case, you're off the hook. So thanks everyone for coming, and just to mention, I suppose this is the first of our lunchtime seminars, so thanks again for the strong attendance. And also a date from the diary is the 24th of May, Friday the 24th of May, for the annual conference, and the brochures which should be going out and the updates in the next 2 weeks, just as our speaker lineup has just been confirmed. So thanks you all for coming. Thank you.